Now, some of you have come today. We're grateful for that, who weren't able to be with us yesterday, and we're kind of continuing on from yesterday. So I'll give a quick kind of background of what we went over last evening. We're talking about this issue of Old Covenant and New Covenant. Now, that issue has been before the people of God for a long time, since the time of the apostles and since the time of the emerging Christian church. The question of how do the followers of Yeshua, and I'll use his Hebrew name, Yeshua, we oftentimes refer to him by his Greek name, anglicized as Jesus. But ever since the time of Yeshua and the emerging Christian church, the question was raised, what is the relationship of the church with the people of Israel? And that came down to another question, a more general question, and that is, what is the relationship of the scriptures that are written before the coming of Yeshua and the scriptures written after his coming, or what is oftentimes called the Old Testament and the New Testament? Last night we realized, we're reminded perhaps, that the Latin word testamentum is where we get our English word testament, and it is the word in Latin for covenant. It's the way the Vulgate Bible translated the word covenant throughout the Old Testament, or Tanakh, and the New Testament, or the Apostolic Scriptures. So when we say Old Testament, in our mind, we're thinking about a collection of books, but it was that title was originally given to mean Old Covenant. When we talk about the New Testament, we're talking about, generally, we think of the books from Matthew through Revelation, and we call that the New Testament, but originally that was named that because it was the belief that that was the New Covenant. And was that the New Covenant that Jeremiah was talking about? We also were reminded last night that the word or the phrase Old Covenant or Old Testament is found one time in the Bible, only once. And we came to the conclusion that there's no way that you can say that the Genesis to Malachi, or the books of the so-called Old Testament, is equivalent to the Old Covenant, nor are the books Matthew through Revelation equivalent with the New Covenant that Jeremiah is talking about. When Yeshua said, "This is the New Covenant in my blood," he wasn't saying this is the books from Matthew through Revelation in my blood. He was saying something else. And so we began to question, what do we mean when we talk about the Old Covenant and the New Covenant? Very often we hear discussions saying the Old Covenant has been done away with and we are part of the New Covenant. But when we begin to ask the definitions of what do you mean by Old Covenant and New Covenant, we're oftentimes kind of left wondering, what exactly is the Old Covenant and the New Covenant? When we looked at 2 Corinthians 3, which is the only time that the phrase Old Covenant is used in the Bible, we saw that it just simply could not mean a different way of salvation. Right? I mean, I've asked people in groups like this, do you believe that people were saved a different way in the Old Covenant than they were saved in the New Covenant? And I hear a lot of people saying, yes, that's what I've been taught. And we noted last night that that's not what Paul thought, because Paul uses Abraham and David in Romans chapter 4 as the examples of what it means to be saved by faith, the same way that the Roman believers had been saved, that he was writing to. So, what is the Old Covenant? We came to the conclusion that the Old Covenant was exactly what Jeremiah was talking about when he said the covenant which you broke. That is, the Old Covenant is when people, particularly in this case, as Paul's talking about in 2 Corinthians 3, when the Jewish people read the Bible that they had at that time, which would have been from Genesis through Malachi. That's not necessarily the order in which the manuscripts have it, but that's how we have it in our Bibles. That when they read that without the Spirit of God, without the Spirit illuminating the text, it was the Old Covenant. Why? Because the Bible, apart from the work of the Spirit, has no ability to change a person's life for faith in God. The Bible by itself doesn't have that power. The letter by itself, what? Kills, condemns. The letter with the Spirit, however, what? Brings life. And you remember that last night we noted how Paul used this concept of the veil. When Moses came down off the mountain at Sinai, his face was shining, right? So he put a veil over his face. And we discussed about why would Moses have done that. And we came to the conclusion that it doesn't tell us really in the book of Exodus, where it gives us that story. It doesn't tell us exactly why he did it, except that it makes a very important statement. It says he put a veil over his face so that they wouldn't see the glory. When we looked again at Paul in 2 Corinthians 3, we realized that he was saying the same thing, using a Greek word, katargeo, which means to render something ineffective. So the veil was put over Moses' face to render the glory ineffective. What would have been what would we have expected the glory to do? To show forth the one whose glory it was. And whose glory was it that was shining in the face of Moses? It was whose glory? Yeshua's glory. How do we know that? It says in Exodus 24 that they went up, Moshe and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and the 70 elders, and they saw the God of Israel. But that isn't where it stops. It says, and underneath his feet was a sea like glass. Moses apparently saw a pre-incarnate Yeshua in bodily form. So the glory that was being hidden was the very glory of Yeshua. Why would God want to hide the glory of Yeshua from Israel? Well, there was no answer to that question, the mystery. But this was a mystery for Paul too. He said that a partial hardening has fallen out upon Israel so that the Gentiles might be gathered in. He uses other metaphors. The branches are broken off so that the wild branches could be grafted in. And he ends that passage in Romans 11 with, the mystery, the glory, the unsearchable nature of God's wisdom. How unsearchable are his ways, right? And his thoughts beyond finding out. And so we came to realize that Paul wasn't putting the Old Testament and pitting it against the New Testament. He was talking about reading the Bible with the faith in Yeshua and with the aid of the Holy Spirit, as opposed to reading the Bible without it. Now, you say, wait a minute, Tim, how did you switch from Moses having a veil to the Bible having a veil? Well, that's exactly what Paul does. Why? When we read Moses, what does that mean? We're reading the Torah. We're reading the law, right? We're reading the first 5 books of the Bible. That's what it means to read Moses. Well, if Moses had a veil so that the glory could not be seen, what Paul is saying is, apart from the Spirit, that Torah scroll that you take out and put on the bima every Shabbat, as they did in the first century, and you begin to read it, it's got a veil over it. And what is hidden? The glory. Whose glory? The glory of Yeshua. When you read that Torah scroll, you don't see Yeshua there. That's the old covenant. But when there's faith in Yeshua, that veil is taken away by the Spirit of God. And then what do you see in the Torah? All the time. You see Yeshua. And so we were contemplating what it must have been like for the Apostle Paul to have reread the book that he had studied since he was a little boy. Now with new eyes, literally, right? He had gone blind. The scales fell off of his eyes so that he gained sight again. And he went and he studied. Well, we presume he studied. He learned a lot as he was away in the desert. And he reread that Bible. And what did he come to the conclusion? That Yeshua is found all the way through. Of course, that's what Yeshua himself said on the road to Emmaus to the disciples. It says, and beginning with Moses and the prophets, he explained himself to them. So in these sessions we looked and we saw that there's not a putting the words of the Torah against the words of the gospel. The things that God revealed to Israel in the so-called Old Testament is not something contrary to what the apostles revealed in the New Testament. It's one complete story, a whole covenant. Now, quickly, because we need to get on with what we're supposed to be doing tonight, we're going to study Hebrews, chapter 8. But what did we decide was the new covenant? And we looked at Jeremiah 31 to 34, and we said, what's new about the new covenant? Is it new that faith in Yeshua saves you? No. Even David looked ahead and saw the resurrection of the Messiah, which means he must have also known about his death, right? Abraham believed God and it was counted to him for righteousness. David said, how blessed is the man to whom the Lord does not impute iniquity. And we know that no one is saved apart from what God has done in his Son Yeshua. So what is the new covenant? We noted carefully that Jeremiah says, and in those days I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And then it goes on to say, and this is the covenant I will make with Israel. We immediately saw that it's going to be at a time when Israel and Judah, that is the northern tribes and the southern tribes, are reunited as one nation. And Ezekiel prophesies this, doesn't he, in chapter 37 and other places. And then it says, no one will have to teach his neighbor, know the Lord. Now I'm giving you a bit of a quiz here. How did we understand the word know? No one will need to teach his brother or his neighbor, saying, know the Lord, for they all shall know him from the least to the greatest.
In the biblical sense.
In the biblical sense, that is to have a covenant relationship. No one will have to teach his neighbor, saying, be loyal to the Lord. And we discerned immediately, that hasn't happened yet. And so the new covenant is in the process of being fulfilled. And it will be fulfilled ultimately when it's fulfilled in the nation of Israel. We have come in as first fruits. We have come in as the dawning of this ultimate redemption, which Paul himself talks about, Romans 11, verses 25 and 26. He says, and then all Israel will be saved. Now, when I teach this kind of a lesson, I've had others say, but wait a minute. Wait just a minute. What about Hebrews 8? Well, some would say, what about the whole book of Hebrews? Others would say, what about the whole book of Galatians? Well, we only have a few sessions, so we can't do all of that tonight. So let's take a look at Hebrews 8. And the question is, what is new and what is passing away? Whenever I see a new English translation, this is one of the texts that I always turn to see what they did with it. There are a number of things that are interesting in the translation, in the English translations of this text. Let's dig in, shall we? Let's get some background to Hebrews 8, and I'm going to stick my neck out on a limb here. I wouldn't fall on my sword for this. I wouldn't actually fall on my pocket knife for this. But I've toyed with the idea that there's the possibility the book of Hebrews was written after the destruction of the temple. The destruction of the temple was in 70. There are some scholars who are quite adamant that the book of Hebrews, the epistle to the Hebrews or to the Messianic Jews, was written before the destruction. I find some things in the book that kind of get me feeling as though it was written after the destruction, and I'm kind of taking that viewpoint in this study. You can, if you want to take another view, please, I understand. I can't prove that to you with clear documentation, but I think there is enough evidence to say it at least is a possibility. Now, why would that be important for me to start out with? I think one of the major things that goes on in the book of Hebrews was a very big question that was being asked by other Jewish communities. We don't know who the author of Hebrews is. Traditionally, it was assigned to Paul. In some of the earliest manuscripts, it's grouped with Pauline epistles. Don't laugh when I tell you that, well, you can laugh if you like. I don't think it's written by Paul for at least a couple of reasons, but one reason is there's nothing in this book about circumcision. And can you read Paul's epistles? I mean, almost always he uses the term circumcision, uncircumcision, and so forth. There's just other things that aren't quite in concert with what Paul seems to his style and emphases. So what was the major question? The major question for all of the Judaisms of the time was, can we live Torah without the temple and priesthood? Or we could put it another way. How can we survive as a Jewish nation without the temple, without the priesthood, without the ability to go into Jerusalem? Because after the defeat of Bar Kokhba in 132 through 136, defeated in 136, there was, Hadrian made a law. Jews are not allowed in Jerusalem, except on the day that commemorates the destruction of the temple, the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av. That day we allow Jews in because we'd like to see them weeping and crying about their defeat. But any other time they can't come. So how are we as a Jewish nation going to survive if we can't even come to the holy city and have to the place where God said he would put his name and his heart and his ears forever? How can we do this? We don't have the priesthood. How can we follow the Torah without sacrifices? So forth and so on. Now, do you suppose that the Jews who had come to faith in Yeshua had the same question? I do. We know that Peter and James and others were very much part of the temple services from the Gospels in the book of Acts. What is the perspective of Hebrews? The tabernacle still exists as well as the priesthood. The book of Hebrews doesn't talk about the temple. It goes back to the tabernacle. Why? We've had 2 temples now. Solomon's temple, the first temple, right? So-called Herod's temple, the second temple. Why doesn't the book concentrate on the temple? Why does it go back to the tabernacle? Well, because the book of Hebrews says the tabernacle still exists and so does the priesthood. That's his answer to the question of how can we continue on. This is because Yeshua is the high priest to whom all other high priests pointed. Everything that was in the tabernacle, the first temple, the second temple, had as its ultimate goal pointing to the priesthood of Yeshua and the true tabernacle in heaven, not made with hands. Right? Just like Moses said, or just like God said to Moses on the mountain, he said, make it exactly like the, shall we say model? The picture that was shown to you on the mountain. So everything that was on the earth was a representation, from the writer to the Hebrews' perspective, a representation of what was the real and true that is in the heavenlies. And then he goes on to talk about and to prove that this priesthood is ordered after the priesthood of Melchizedek as compared to Aaron. Okay, so Melchizedek as opposed or as compared to Aaron. All right. It's always important when we study the scriptures that we study context, and it's really nice if you can figure out what the main point of a section is. What's even nicer is if the writer himself tells you what the main point is. Now, the main point in what has been said is this. We have a high priest, such a high priest, who has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister in the sanctuary, and in the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched, not man. Okay? So, I might ask you this once or twice more, but I'll see if you're on track with me. What is the main point that the writer has made up to this point in the book of Hebrews? We have a high priest in the true tabernacle. Right? Okay, so if that's his main point, if that's what he's talking about, let's keep that in mind. That will help us understand what he's going to say in the next section. For every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices. So it is necessary that this high priest also have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all. Who's the he that he's talking about? Yeshua. Why wouldn't he be a priest at all? because he's not of the tribe of Levi, and the Levites are the tribe from which the high priest must come, from the family of Aaron. Okay? Since there are those who offer the gifts according to the Torah, who serve a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. Just as Moses was warned by God when he was about to erect the tabernacle, for, see, he, that is God, says, that you make all things according to the pattern which was shown you on the mountain. But now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, by as much as he is also the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for a second. Now wait a minute. We talked yesterday about Old Covenant, New Covenant, but we didn't talk about First Covenant and Second Covenant, or if that's what we're talking about here. Any ideas? What would the first covenant be? If the first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for a second. Any ideas? Abrahamic, but of course, good idea. But of course, the Abrahamic covenant is the first covenant, is it? There was a covenant before that, wasn't it? Noah? Was there a covenant made with Adam? What does our Pauline scholar think? Did Paul think that there was a covenant made with Adam? Well, the word covenant is never used. Unless, of course, you take the translation in Hosea to mean Adam rather than man. Okay. But how would that fit? If the first covenant, the covenant made with Adam, had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for a second. Okay, so what would be the second?
Covenant with Noah.
This is hard. This is kind of hard and difficult to understand, isn't it? Yes?
Well, last night you told us that the Old Covenant was only mentioned once in the Bible. Is this talking about the covenant for sure?
Okay, good question. Now, see, if you were to, you could do this on eSword, you could do this online somewhere where you have a Bible that tells you what is there and what is not there, because guess what? The word covenant is not there. It just said, for if that first had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for the second. Now, we know that the main point is the priesthood, but in this immediate context, he's talking about the tabernacle, right? The temples and so forth and so on. So, if that first tabernacle, that is, that first earthly tabernacle had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for a second. Or is the main point the priesthood? He's talking about the priesthood, right? What was the main point again? We have a high priest. For if the first had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for a second. In other words, if the first priesthood, if the Aaronic priesthood had been without fault, there would have been no need to seek a greater, better high priest. Well, did the Aaronic priesthood do what they were supposed to do? Probably in the time of the first century, exactly right. No, the high priesthood was very corrupt. We realize that. But let's go back a little ways. Let's go back in the time of the tabernacle. Did Aaron do what he was supposed to do? Well, don't you love that, the way that phrase after Moses comes down off the mountain and there's the golden calf and he says, Aaron, I'm paraphrasing, what in the world did you do? And he said, look, all I did was take all this gold and silver and throw it into the fire and out jumped this calf. That's literally what it says. Out came this calf. But we see Aaron doing what he was supposed to do, putting on the vestments, going into the most holy place on Yom Kippur, offering sacrifices, so forth and so on. But what was it that now I'm going to not ask you for the answer here, I'm going to ask you all to think about this. What was it that the first high priesthood, how was it less than what it should be, or less than what it could be? Okay?
Well, he might have done a pretty good job, but
two of his sons messed up, Nadab and Abihu. What exactly was the high priest supposed to do?
Offer sacrifices.
Offer sacrifices. Anything else?
Supposed to get a word from the Lord?
Possibly, yes. In the Urim and the Tumim, in the pouch there on his ephod.
Cool clothes to wear.
He had a lot of cool clothes to wear. He was supposed to be a mediator between God and Israel. Right? Or we can make it broader, between God and man. If we want to look at a spatial way of looking at it, a priest has his back towards the people and his face towards God. Right? He is part of the people. He represents the people to God. What does a prophet do? A prophet has his back towards God and his face towards the people. Right? I'm representing God to you. Now, did the Aaronic high priest do the right job at representing the people to God? Well, I'm not sure how to answer that. Well, let's go on and see what our writer says. But it appears quite clearly that if the first priesthood had been without fault, if the first priesthood was able to accomplish everything that the priesthood should have been able to accomplish, or was, figured or pictured to accomplish, there would have been no occasion to seek for a better high priest. Right? You only need something better if what you've got isn't good enough. Like some of us are constantly asking for a faster, better computer. All right? Because we think that if we have to wait 2.5 nanoseconds for something to finish, that's too long. Verse 8, for finding fault with whom? Oh, them. It doesn't say finding fault with a covenant. For finding fault with them, he says, behold, days are coming, says the Lord, when I will enact a new covenant. Now we know where this is from, don't we? We just studied this last night, Jeremiah 31, with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And of course, then it continues on, and I haven't given you all of those verses because we studied it verse by verse last night, Jeremiah 31 through 34. And he quotes that text. And then he goes on in verse 13. When he said a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. Now this is my favorite verse to look at when I open up a new English translation. I want to see how they translated this verse. He said a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete, but whatever is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to disappear. Now, wow. That seems to controvert everything I've said up to this point, including yesterday.
It does.
Yeah-oh. But in some of your translations, you're going to notice that the word covenant's in italics. It's not there. The word covenant is left out so as not to confuse what is meant by the first. When he said anew, now I know that he's talking about the covenant, but the new covenant means there has to be something better than what it was. Let's rehearse again. What's the difference between the new covenant and the old covenant? The old covenant is when you seek to have a relationship with God apart from Yeshua and the Spirit. The new covenant is when the Torah is written where? Not just on parchment, but the Torah is written on your heart, which means what? You have a change of heart. We can read Ezekiel 36. He says, there's coming a day when I'm going to put a new spirit within you. I'm going to take the heart of stone out. I'm going to put a heart of flesh in. And I'm going to pour out my Spirit upon you. I'm going to pour out water, clean water, and wash you and make you clean. And then what will happen? You will walk in my ways. You see, the new covenant is a change of heart. It's a writing of God's Torah, God's teaching, God's ways upon our heart. So when he says anew, he has made the first obsolete. He didn't put the word covenant in there because he wants us to understand when he says new, he has made the first, that is the first priesthood, obsolete. Why do you need a new covenant? Because the original Aaronic priesthood couldn't do what God intended. What is it that God intended? A change of heart. Let me ask you this. Let's say a person in the first century, it's time for Passover, Pesach. He's not into it. So I'm tired of all this stuff. Why couldn't God make me a Gentile so I don't have to do these things? That's tongue-in-cheek, by the way, for those of you that have had discussion this afternoon. But no, come on. Why do I have to do all this? I have to stop everything. It's in the middle of the harvest or the beginning of the harvest. I have to stop. But you know what? All of my neighbors are going to think I'm really some kind of a lout if I don't participate. Okay, so I'm going to go out. I'll take my lamb. I trudge down to the temple. It's a long journey. I get there. I take my lamb up and I give it to the priest. And the priest will ask me certain questions like, are you clean? Do you have clean hands? So forth and so on. And then he's obligated to take my lamb and sacrifice, take the blood, put it on the altar, give it back to me. He can't ask me, or he can't know, is your heart right? Are you doing this with the right motive? Are you doing this for the right reasons? No, he can't do that. So I can go back and take my lamb and roast it and have my Passover, and everybody thinks, oh, well, this guy's doing okay, whatever. And nobody knows that my heart is totally against obeying God. I've just gone through the motions. And the priest had no way of knowing that. And even if he had known it, he couldn't have denied me the sacrifice. That's not his place. What we need is a priest who can change the heart. We need a priest who can cleanse the conscience from dead works. We need a priest who can make me willing to do what he wants. Now, some of you may not like that, make me willing. Let me just comment about that quickly. I probably say this too often, but it makes sense to me. I hope it makes sense to you. And as long as my wife doesn't listen to this, I won't have to pay her any extra money. I'm going to use my wife as an illustration. When I first saw my wife, Paulette, I had been praying for some time that God would show me the woman he wanted me to marry. Shortly after I met her, in one of the few times that I honestly believe God made specific communication to me about a specific thing, he said, she's the one. I had to love her. I didn't have a choice. But I didn't feel trapped. I wasn't turning around saying, why do I have to do this? I didn't have a choice. I really didn't. You know what I'm talking about? When you are certain that you know that this person is the one that God intends you to marry, and you already are very much attracted to that person, it's not hard to love that person, even though you're commanded to do it. Why? There's been a change of heart. One more illustration along the same lines. I have a tendency to be a little bit impatient with bad drivers. I don't mind it if somebody's having some difficulty. I just don't like it when drivers don't use their brains. Okay? And so my wife, God bless her, has constantly helped me be patient. Said, Tim, just be patient, just be patient, just be patient. And I'll say, well, why can't this person go at least half the speed limit? One day, she was downtown in her car. She called me on herself, or she called me from a phone booth actually, and said, Tim, the car stopped. I can't get it started. Please, can you come in and help me? I said, okay, I'll be right down there. I went down there, opened it up. It had a vapor lock. It was having problems with gas and so forth and so on, getting the gas into the carburetor. And so I got it started, and I said, okay, sweetheart, I'm going to follow you, and we're going to go home, and I'll be right behind you. And this car stopped and sputtered and jerked and went forward and didn't make the green light, And I was behind her, and all the time I'm saying, it's okay, we're going to make it. Don't worry. Just keep going. I'm right here. I'm with you. Okay, go. Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay, we made that light. Good. What was the difference? If I'd have been behind somebody who didn't know what I had been saying, get that piece of junk off the road, etc. See what I'm saying? What was the difference? I had a heart difference towards the person that was driving that car. I had a relationship with that person. You see, when I say we needed a high priest who would make us love God, we have a high priest who shows us the glories of God in a way that changes our hearts. that makes us just marvel at everything that he does. So that when we do even the smallest things around the day, we say, Lord, thank you. Thank you for helping me do that. Thank you for giving me this. Thank you for the sunshine. Thank you even for the rain. Thank you, Lord, for what I see. Thank you for my friends. Lord, you have given me so much. Nobody has to tell me to do that. Why? I've had a heart change. That's what the high priest was supposed to do. Mediate between me and God. So, I believe that when it says he made the first obsolete, he's talking about the Aaronic priesthood. I also believe from Matthew 24 and other portions of Scripture that one of the reasons that God allowed the temple to be destroyed under Titus was because this had to happen. In order for all Israel to be saved, they had to come to realize they could not depend upon the Aaronic priesthood to bring them to God. The Aaronic priesthood was to be a sign, a symbol, a picture of how they were to come to God through the one who was eternally the Son of God and became the greater high priest. So when he said, a new covenant? No, there's no covenant there. Let's summarize what we've learned so far. The main point is the priesthood of this passage. The author's perspective is that in order for the new covenant to become a reality, there would have to be a change in the priesthood. Why? Because what's the essence of the new covenant? The Torah written on the heart. Could the Aaronic priesthood write the Torah on the heart? No. Those of us that are in leadership, that we've been pastors or missionaries, whatever, how many times have we thought, oh, if I could just change that person's heart? Here you're counseling with a person or a family and you're saying, don't you know how wonderful it would be if you would obey the Lord? Don't you know what kind of grace would be in your life if you would take this step of faith? It's like when my first son was born. My wife was in labor for 26 hours and it wasn't happening. And she was in some pretty tough labor at times and it wasn't happening. And I remember thinking, oh Lord, how can I stop this to give her a rest? And the Lord reminded me, you don't stop this. Labor starts, it goes. And then they decided it had to be C-section. And I left the room and went out into the hallway and the doctor was there and I said, he's a believer, and I said, Dr. Atkinson, in there I was feeling exactly the way I felt sometimes when I've been talking to some unsaved people about Yeshua. I want to grab them by the collar and say, don't you understand? You must be born again. Will you not be born now? How can I make this happen? We can't make it happen. There's only one person that can make it happen, that can change the heart, that can take the scales off the eyes. And that person is God himself. Yeshua, the work of the Spirit. We need that high priest to make the new covenant a reality. In order for there to be a change in the priesthood, the Aaronic priesthood would have to cease. And I believe this is his explanation, the writer's explanation for the destruction of the temple. The problem was with the people, including the priests, not with the covenant. It wasn't the covenant's problem. Paul makes this clear in Romans 2. It wasn't that the covenant, that the law, that the Torah was bad. God gave the Torah for certain and important reasons, but it wasn't so that people could be saved by trying to keep it. Why is a change of priesthood necessary? Let's look at the characteristics of the Aaronic priesthood, the priesthood that came from Aaron. They were sinners themselves. They were earthly. They were unable to change the heart of the worshiper. They were mortal. That is, they died. There had to be a constant upgrading and changing of the priesthood. They could not write the Torah on the heart. Therefore, they could not bring about the new covenant. What about the Melchizedekian priesthood? The priesthood after the order of Melchizedek was without sin, heavenly, and we're talking about Yeshua here, able to change the heart of the worshiper, eternal, and could write the Torah on the heart. That is, could bring about the new covenant. That's why there has to be a change in the priesthood. Let's go on. Verse 6. But now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, by as much as he is also the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted on better promises. What is the better covenant? I believe it is the new covenant. What are the better promises? It's that the Torah would be written on the heart of the whole nation. Right? There's coming a time when no one will have to teach his neighbor or his brother, be loyal to the Lord. They will all be loyal to Him, from the least to the greatest. How is the new covenant better than the former covenant or covenants? It promises a heart change. Right? It promises a heart change. And this would require a priest who could change the heart of stone to a heart of flesh. By the way, I don't know if any of you have ever attended a circumcision. We've had numbers of them in our community. We have a couple of Moels who can do that within our community. And I can guarantee you it would be very difficult to circumcise a stone. And we're told, circumcise your hearts. Right? What is the whole point of circumcision? Don't rely on the flesh. Don't rely on your own ability. You don't have the ability. That's what Abraham was supposed to figure out. He didn't figure it out until after Ishmael came along. And God told him, no, the one son that's coming is from a miraculous work of God, not your own strength. Circumcision is a sign given to us to say, don't rely upon your own strength. Rely only upon God. We need hearts of flesh. Let's go on. Verse 7. For if the first, and we know that word covenant is not there, right? So let's strike it out. For the first had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for a second. I think it means the priesthood, as you know. For if the first priesthood had been faultless, there would have been an occasion sought for the second priesthood. That is, the contrast is between the Aaronic priesthood and the priesthood of Melchizedek. We know that from the beginning of the chapter. The contrast is between the first ministry, service in the tabernacle or temple, and the second ministry of the Melchizedek priest in the heavenly tabernacle. What do we know about this priesthood of Melchizedek? Well, it's kind of strange, and this is why our writer to the Hebrews uses it. Isn't it something when you're reading the book of Genesis? I hope you've all read the book of Genesis. If you haven't, I commend it to you. It's good reading. You're reading along, just everything's fine. All of a sudden, chapter 14 comes up, and guess what? There's somebody there you don't even know. You'd never heard of him. He just shows up. But even more interesting is it said he's a priest of God Most High. How could he be a priest of God Most High? We haven't had the Torah yet. There's no tabernacle. What could a priest do? Very strange. What does the term Melchizedek mean? King of righteousness. And of what city was he king? Pardon me? Yeah, and Salem means what? Peace. It's from the word shalom. We have it also in Psalm 110. Is David a priest like Melchizedek? That's interesting. We look at that. We see in 2 Samuel 6 that David wears the ephod, and he offers sacrifices to God. And if we've never read the story before, we're really nervous. Because we started in 1 Samuel, and what did the first king of Israel do? Remember? They were out in the battlefield, and he's hoping that Samuel will come to help. They've taken the ark out there, and they're not winning. And he's called for Samuel, come quick, we need some sacrifices to help us win. And Samuel tarries. And what does Saul do? He offers sacrifices. And then what happens? Samuel comes and says, what have you done? And then he says, okay, this is what God has said. Saul, in desperation, holds on to the hem of Samuel's garment and tears it. And Samuel says, this is a good illustration. In the same way that you've torn the hem of my robe, so God is tearing the kingdom away from you. Kings aren't supposed to offer sacrifices. That's for the priests. And then we keep reading, and we see David, and he goes into Jerusalem. and he's taken the ark into Jerusalem finally, and he's wearing the ephod. We're going, David, no, no, no. And then it says he offered sacrifice again. Oh, no, David, didn't you learn your lesson from Saul? It reminds me one time when I was in an opera, and it was I was attending an opera, and it was a time, yeah, and it was a time when all of the grade school kids had been given free tickets to come to the opera during the day. And down on stage was the typical opera scene where the villain is hiding behind a rock with a knife, and the fair maiden who was waiting for her man to come into the forest is waiting and singing about how beautiful it's going to be, and the villain is behind the rock ready to do her in, and some little girl from the top balcony, right when the music paused and there was a little bit of break, she goes, "Watch out, he's behind the rock!" Well, she had really gotten into the storyline, that's for sure. But when we read this storyline, we think to ourselves, David, what are you doing? The very thing that caused Saul to lose the kingdom, you're doing it now. But guess what? Nothing happens to David. God blesses him. And what is more, we discover in a couple chapters later that David's sons are specifically called priests. Let's look and see. So David reigned over all Israel. David administered justice and righteousness for all his people. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was over the army, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was recorder. Zadok, the son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, the son of Aviatar, were priests, and Seraiah was secretary. Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and the Peletites, and David's sons were, and our English translation says, chief ministers. But in fact, it says in the Hebrew, Kohanim. Kohanim is priests. Now, I don't know how that is possible. Neither do the rabbis. They're baffled at that. How in the world could David's sons be priests? Well, the King James Version, the New King James Version, the New American Standard Bible, the NIV all mistranslate. The RSV and the New RSV and the Jewish Publication Society all have priests. At least they're honest with the text. What does that mean? Was David really a priest? We go to Psalm 110. Now, remember, we're at this track. I know I'm going a little quickly because I have a lot of material to cover. But our question is this. What is the Melchizedek priesthood? What does that mean? Psalm 110, a psalm of David. Yod He Vav He, Adonai says to my master, sit at my right hand. Who's talking? God, the Lord, Yod He Vav He, says to my master. Who's writing this psalm? David. Who's David's master? David's king, right? Who is the master of David? Well, Yod He Vav He is talking to somebody. Yeah, it must be Yeshua. Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord, Yod He Vav He, sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Sends forth Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your foes. Your people will offer themselves freely on the day you lead your hosts upon the holy mountains. From the womb of the morning like dew, your youth will come to you. Yod He Vav He has sworn and will not change his mind. You, who's he talking to? Well, is he talking to David or is he talking to David's master? David's master. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. The one speaking is Yod He Vav He, the Lord, Adonai. He's speaking to David's master. His priesthood is an eternal priesthood. Those are the things that we learn immediately by reading this. And his priesthood is like that of Melchizedek's. Now let's find out, what does that mean? Yeshua quoted this, didn't he? In Matthew 22. While the Pharisees were gathered together, Yeshua asked them a question. Watch out when Yeshua asks you questions. By the way, If we stand before him, if you stand before him and he asks you the question, why should I allow you entrance into my kingdom, my eternal kingdom? Don't start doing what the people in chapter 7 of Matthew did. Don't start talking about what you've done. Did we not do wonderful things? Didn't we have seminars? Didn't we cast out demons? Didn't we prophesy in your name? Didn't we do this and we do this? And didn't I do this and I do that? No, don't do that. Get ready for that exam. When the question comes, why should you be allowed to enter in? Say, it's because of what you have done. I'm resting in what you have done. I can do nothing, but you have done all that needs to be done. So he said, what do you think about the Messiah? Whose son is he? They said to him, the son of David. That was common. The Messiah was to come from the family of David. He said to them, then how does David in the Spirit, what does that tell us? Our own Lord and Master wants us to be settled on the doctrine of inspiration. The word of the Bible that we carry in our hands and on our computers and our iPhones and wherever else we may have it is the very inspired word of God. It's the work of his Spirit. David, in the Spirit, called him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, my Master, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies beneath your feet. If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son? Right? I mean, I don't refer to my son Caleb as my master. The Father is above the Son in our normal human way of looking at things, right? So, David says, the Lord said to my master, to my Lord. Who was his Lord? And no one was able to answer him a word, nor did anyone dare from that day on to ask him another question. The psalm is not about David, it's about Messiah Yeshua. Like David, Messiah is both king and priest. Right? We just saw how David came in with the ark, had the ephod on, and his sons are called Kohanim. He offered sacrifices and he wasn't reprimanded for it. Meaning what? God accepted David as a priest functioning in that way. Like David, Messiah is both priest and king. Messiah's priesthood is like Melchizedek's. How? Melchizedek should not have been a priest because he wasn't related to the tribe of Levi. So how did Melchizedek become a priest? By God's specific choice. God said, you'll be my priest at this time in this place. And that's exactly what he said to David. David became a priest because God chose him specifically to be so. There's somebody else who's a priest who's not from the tribe of Levi too. Who is that? Yeshua. That's how he's a priest after the order or after the kind of Melchizedek. Not by lineage, but by specific appointment by God. Let's look at the paraphrase of 8:13, Hebrews 8:13. In saying new, he regards the first priesthood as obsolete because it could never effect the new covenant by writing the Torah on the heart of the worshipers. And since the destruction of the temple, the Aaronic priesthood is growing less and less viable and is ready to vanish away. You see, I was taken with the idea that it says, and what is growing old is ready to disappear. What does it mean, ready to disappear? Didn't the priesthood disappear at 70 when Titus came and destroyed the temple? There is some evidence that sacrifices continued after the destruction. Did you know that? Josephus talks about it, and so it's also found in the Talmud, that even after the temple had been destroyed, while there was still the opportunity for Jews to be in Jerusalem, some of the priests that had been in the temple who escaped the massacre would go up to the Temple Mount and sacrifice the Passover sacrifice on the stone where the altar had stood. Mishnah arguments address questions of sacrifice without the temple. They're saying, could we do that? Is that right? Even though it's the right place, there isn't a temple there, or there isn't a structure. Can we do that? So it seems as though there's evidence is that it was fading away. It didn't just stop. And for how many years? Some suggest that for 10 to 13 years, up until about the mid-80s, they were still trying to offer sacrifices on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Let's go on a little bit after chapter 8 because there's a little more we want to cover in chapter 9. Now, even the first covenant, guess what? Word covenant's not there. You say, Tim, how would I know that? Can I trust my Bible? Yes, you can. You've got plenty of sources, okay? You can go online and look at an interlinear Bible where it gives you every Greek word and every English word above it. When you don't see the word covenant in there, say, what's going on? Ask some questions. Have a study Bible that uses italics for words that are added. And when you see an italic word, go back and read the verse without the italic word and see what it sounds like. We have plenty of options to read the Scriptures as compared with the originals, the Greek and the Hebrew. You say, well, why would they have put the first covenant in? Why would they have put the word covenant in? It's because, let's face it, a couple thousand years of Christian theology has basically said that the old covenant, that is the law of Moses, has been destroyed. That's part of, that's just woven into the thinking of some people, and it shows up oftentimes in sermons and translations. So I'm not saying that the translations are all wrong, but I'm saying you still should check them. Now, if the first priesthood had regulations for worship and an earthly sanctuary, that's right, they did. Later on in that same chapter it says, now when these things have been so prepared, the priests are continually entering and it says in the English, outer, but really it's the word first, protos, are actually entering the first tabernacle performing the divine worship. But into the second, only the high priest enters once a year, not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the sins of the people committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit is signifying this, that the way into the holy place has not yet been disclosed while not the outer, but the first tabernacle is still standing, which is a symbol for the present time. Accordingly, both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make the worshiper perfect in conscience. You can't write the gifts and sacrifices offered by the Aaronic priesthood could not change the heart, could not purify the conscience, since they relate only to food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until a time of Reformation. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with having the right food and the right drink and various washings, because were pictures of how God intended for us to know His way of salvation. Let's think about it for a minute. This is a bird's eye view of the tabernacle, okay? Holy place and most holy place. Why did He say first and second? He could have said outer and inner. Okay, that would have been okay. But I think He did it for a specific reason, and I'll try to show that to you. What are the articles of the furniture in the tabernacle? Well, we have the Ark of the Covenant in the most holy place, right? And these are symbolic, please, not by any artist and not by a percentage of size and so forth. Okay. We have the altar of incense, which on the day of Yom Kippur was clearly right in front of the veil, and from which the high priest took coals and incense to go into the most holy place. And then we had the menorah, and we had the table of bread, or the bread of the presence. Okay? This holy place is the first, according to our author. That's what he's calling it. And the most holy place is the second. Why would he do that? I think he's using it as an illustration. He's asking himself this question. Why would God have made the tabernacle in two parts? How many times did the high priest every year go into the most holy place? Once. How often did they go into the holy place? Every day. Now, the cycle of 1 year is the full and complete cycle of all the festivals, right? So there's a sense in which 1 year of cycle of festivals is like the whole story. It's the history of everything. In fact, what's the last festival in the current, when you start with Passover, what does the festival cycle end with? Huh? Well, let's for now not consider Purim and Hanukkah because those are, let's just talk about Sukkot.
Yeah.
How many days is Sukkot?
7 with an 8th day at the end.
Yeah, good. When you say how many days are Sukkot, some people say 7. I say you're right. Some people say 8. You say you're right. I say they can't be right. They can't be. Yeah, they're both right.
Yeah.
Right? Right. And why is that? It says you shall dwell 7 days in the Sukkah, right? And the first day and the last day, okay? But then he said, and on the 8th day, so wait a minute, you said 7 days, it says on the 8th day, what does this symbolically kind of move us to remember? Is that the dwelling that goes on in Sukkot is a picture of the dwelling of God with us. It's the picture of Him dwelling with us in a complete time, in a complete way. And so what's the 8th day? It never ends. It's not the first day. It's the 8th day, right? It's the day that follows Shabbat. You have the whole picture. You have the whole picture there. And he goes into the most holy place only once in that whole time. Are you starting to get the idea? The first part, our author is saying, the reason why God wanted the tabernacle to be in 2 parts is because the first part represents the earthly. All of the time, the priest going in every day, it's the common morning, afternoon, evening, it's the cycle of life, it's the earthly part of the tabernacle. Why would the most holy place then be thought of as the heavenly tabernacle? Let's just center ourselves on the day of Yom Kippur because that's what is the primary day in the mind of the author of the book of Hebrews. We know that, okay? When we read him, he has Yom Kippur in mind. Okay. The sacrifice is made out on the altar. I'm not talking about the goat that's let go, but the goat of atonement is made on the altar. Now, once the goat has been sacrificed and the blood has been spilled and gathered, has atonement been made yet? Okay. Once he brings that pitcher of that vessel of blood into the holy place and gets a censer of coals with handful of incense, has atonement been made yet? What must happen for atonement to be made? He must enter into the most holy place, sprinkle the blood upon the Ark of the Covenant after he has filled the place with the smoke of the incense on the hot coals. Now, how does that work out? With a picture of Yeshua. Where was the lamb slain? On the earth. Right? Jerusalem. Golgotha. Okay. Has atonement been made?
Yes, but there's more.
I thought that the blood had to go into the most holy place before atonement was made. That's the picture we have in Yom Kippur. Okay? How did the blood shed at Golgotha? I know we're talking in metaphor, we're talking in picture, but this is theologically important. How did the blood from Golgotha get into the most holy place with regard to Yeshua being the high priest? He had to ascend. He had to ascend. How many times did he die? How many times did he ascend? That's the whole picture. The 1 year. One time. The high priest taking the blood from the altar through the holy place into the most holy place. There to intercede for us. The writer to Hebrews says, he always lives to make intercession for us. What is incense a picture of in the Bible? Prayer. Why did the high priest have to come in with incense and with blood? Not just with blood, but with incense and with blood. Because how is the blood, and again I remind you we're talking about a metaphor here, but how is the blood, the death of Yeshua, applied to us? Through prayer. Right? What does Yeshua pray? What is his intercession? He prays that the worth and the value and the purpose of his death will be fully realized. Don't you love that? Just after the garden scene, and they taking Yeshua away, and they take him in, and they scourge him, and they put the thorns on him, and Peter's out, and he's already become a wimp spiritually, and some little girl has caused him to lie and to deny Yeshua. And Yeshua comes back out, and he says he looked at Peter. Wouldn't you just like to have that on a video? That look. And what did he say to Peter? Peter, Satan desires to sift you like wheat. But I have, what? Prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. He always lives to intercede for us. So the first is earthly, the second is heavenly. The earthly is a copy. The heavenly is the real sanctuary. The earthly priests are the picture. Yeshua is the real thing, the real priest. So the two-part tabernacle, I believe, is viewed by our author as a midrash. It's viewed as symbolic of the heavenly and earthly. First and second match up with earthly and heavenly. The first tabernacle, earthly, was taken away to force Israel to see the Melchizedek priest and heavenly tabernacle. When the first is taken away, it is not talking about a covenant. It's talking about the destruction of the temple and the taking away of that earthly, so that the focus now could be upon the heavenly, and the earthly was to be an ongoing picture. We've seen it. How many times have we seen it? How many times have we gone to the tabernacle, to the temples, given our sacrifices, seen it millennia after millennia? We know the picture. Now let's get it straight, what it's all about. For this reason, we read in verse 15 that he is a mediator of a new covenant, so that since a death has taken place for the redemption of the transgression that were committed under the first covenant, those who have been called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. First covenant is the covenant which Israel broke. The new covenant requires a new priesthood who can change the heart and write the Torah upon it. So let's summarize. This whole passage is talking about a contrasting priesthood. The new priesthood was needed to effect the new covenant. Couldn't have the new covenant with the Aaronic priesthood. The Aaronic priesthood is fading away, obsolete, after the destruction of the temple. Covenants are viewed nationally. First covenant did not effect national salvation. New covenant will. Right? We learned that last night. House of Israel, house of Judah. So Jeremiah 31 in this text expresses the need for a different priesthood. How is Jeremiah's covenant going to be realized with the current priesthood? Impossible. Because why? The current priesthood is simply pointing us to the real priesthood who would effect the new covenant. Yeshua is the only high priest who can effect the new covenant. It's not the annulling of one covenant in order to enact another covenant. It's the purpose of the first covenant to obey God. That's why the Torah was given. Now put upon the heart, and therefore affecting what God intends. So what is new about the new covenant? The Torah written on the heart, is that new? No, I don't think so. David had the Torah written on his heart. I think Abraham did too. It says Abraham was a friend of God. Abraham walked with God. Do you have the Torah written on your heart? I think you do if you're a believer in Yeshua, because the writer of the Hebrews tells us that we're part of the new covenant. The new covenant means Torah written on the heart. God's teaching written on the heart. Faithfulness to God in His covenant. Is that new? No, that's not new. There have been people there's been a remnant in Israel and throughout the time of people who have been faithful to the Lord. Look at Daniel. Consider the heroes of the faith listed in Hebrews 11. Were these people not faithful to God and His covenant? Yes, absolutely. That's not new. Sins and transgressions forgiven? Is that new? Of course not. Yeshua makes that very clear when He talks to those who have come to faith and had their sins forgiven. So all who comprise the believing remnant, whether Jew or non-Jew, have always been members of the new covenant as the first fruits of the final harvest. What's the final harvest? When all Israel will be saved. And we are the first fruits. We talked about that a little bit this afternoon because people had some questions. I said, look, think of a glass, and you're pouring water into it. Okay? When is it fulfilled? When it's full, when you can't get any more water in it. But every part of the water that you put in is a filling up of that glass. So the new covenant has been an extant whenever the Torah is written upon the heart. It's a filling up. When is it going to be complete? When all Israel is saved. It's not time-bound. Israel is a nation having the Torah written on her heart and living in loyalty to her God. Would that be new? As a nation. Has there ever been a time when Israel has been loyal to her God as a nation? No. Israel as a nation receiving the Messiah, Yeshua, the very goal of the Torah. Has that ever happened nationally? No. Israel as a nation receiving the forgiveness of sins and transgressions, which comes by faith in Yeshua. Has that ever happened? No. When Israel as a nation experiences these things, then the new covenant is fulfilled. That will be something new. And each one of us have a foretaste of that newness right now. Because we're part of that filling up of the new covenant.